But now BBC Radio 4, it's time to enter another moral maze. Here's Michael Buerk.
Good evening. The wave of public concern following the murder of 10-year-old Damilola Taylor on the North Peckham estate in London last week just won't go away. And it clearly transcends the heart-wrenching individual tragedy of Damilola's death at the hands, it's assumed, of other children. It's focused attention on growing violence and lawlessness amongst the young, not just on poor estates, not just in this country. Statistics as well as anecdotes suggest rises in vandalism, drugs, bullying, mugging, rape. Who's to blame? The right point to a loss of respect for authority and a weakening of society's will to enforce standards of behaviour. The left to widening inequality in an increasingly materialistic society. Most agree, for it seems inescapable, that broken families, looser and less cohesive communities are major factors that seem to propel the problem down the generations. It was said this week that we're now a society that's become afraid of its own children. Who is really to blame when they get into trouble? Do we have a collective moral responsibility for the upbringing of the young that we're failing to discharge? Our moral maze tonight, most of our regular panel, Janet Daley of The Telegraph, the medical ethicist from Oxford, Dr. David Cook, Professor Ian Hargreaves, the former editor, and in place of Dr. Starkey, Peter Hitchens, author and columnist on the Daily Express. Janet Daley, are we all to blame? Yes, even you, Janet, are you to blame?
No, I don't think we're all equally to blame. There was a time when virtually all law-abiding adults were prepared to take on some responsibility for the public behaviour of the young. But that collective authority in which the police and the community reinforced one another relied on a shared belief in what was unequivocally right and wrong. For the past 30 years or so, there's been a systematic assault on the conviction that anything is definitively right or wrong, and on the belief that anyone has the right to exercise moral authority over anyone else. And without those things, community responsibility for the moral education of children becomes impossible.
David Cook.
Well, what concerns me is when we talk about the problem of lawlessness, that we divide into right and left. And, of course, it's both and, not an either-or. But actually the problem faces all of us, and the response needs to be one which we together as a community actually produce. It's easy enough to describe the problem, but what cure and what prescription are we going to give?
Peter Hitchens.
There is no togetherness, that's the problem. The left still insists on blaming purely economic factors, and here in one of the richest societies ever known to man, there are still many people who blame material poverty for the howling wilderness which has engulfed places such as Peckham. Why are they so anxious to avoid the truth that it is profound moral poverty, the collapse of conscience and responsibility, which now threatens our civilization? Is it possible that our ruling liberal elite so despise the old rules that they're prepared to sacrifice society rather than admit that they've got practically everything wrong for the past 40 years?
Ian Hargreaves.
Well, one thing I'm sure of is that this is not a subject well served by the political cliches you summarised, Michael, in your introduction and exemplified in what Peter's just said. What we need to ask is why we find it so hard to involve ourselves in the fate of others. On the streets of Peckham, it may be instinctive fear, but it's surely also got something to do with our obsession with economic individualism, privacy and choice, all of these virtues normally championed by the likes of Peter.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Steve Quashie, who's a youth work trainer at Goldsmiths College in London and formerly a social worker at Wandsworth Social Services. Steve, what do you say to those who maintain that these problems are almost entirely due to the breakdown of traditional family patterns?
I think that traditional family is a problematic term. If you mean by traditional family, nuclear family, then I think
Well, I suppose I mean married couples with children.
Yeah, if we think about those married couples with children, I don't believe that those are really traditional expressions of family. They're the traditional families that, in terms of the last century, but not really much further than beyond. We need to think about extended family. And extended family has always been complex. It's always involved people who are not just blood related, but can relate in a sense of community. So I think.
So you're saying not a father, mother, and two children, but a kind of clan. That's what you want to get.
Yeah,
back to.
I think the whole thing of parents having all the responsibility for bringing up children is a difficult one for parents to cope with. The parents can be isolated in their relationships with children. It actually takes more than two adults to begin to develop a normalising way for children to relate.
And just very briefly, if you were to point the finger of blame, where would you point it? Very briefly.
I wouldn't point the finger of blame. I think blame is an unhelpful concept for this issue. I think responsibility is more helpful, and it has to happen on a number of levels. It has to happen at the family level. The young people need to take responsibility for themselves. Families need to take responsibility, but the community and society also have big roles to play in terms of taking responsibility.
Janet Daley, your witness.
I don't understand your distinction between traditional families and extended families. Presumably, if you're such a fan of the extended family, you ought then to be a great supporter of marriage, because the first victim of the breakdown of marriage is the extended family. One set of grandparents, for example, gets completely sidelined when you don't have a married relationship for raising children.
I do believe in marriage. I haven't got a problem with marriage. Marriage isn't a negative concept for me. It's actually a positive concept. I believe in faithful relationships. I think people need to be engaged with their children. But I don't think we can make an assumption that because there is marriage breakdown, that's the main reason for the issues that we're seeing.
But I understood you to say that the kind of community we're all worried about is a network of extended families.
No, I never said that. I said that if we're talking about traditional families, we need to be clear about what we're talking about. And the nuclear family isn't necessarily the traditional family.
Okay, but how does that help us then? If that's all that you're saying, if that very limited claim is all that your argument consists of, where does that get us?
Well, it gets us in terms of looking at how our communities are structured and work. If we're looking for answers to the issues, or we're looking to say where we can take responsibility from within these situations, it's to begin to say, actually, at a community level, how can we enable communities to take responsibility for themselves, not to impose a law? Well, I think number one is about resources. There needs to be resources in a number of ways. Economic resources, I believe, are important, but not just economic resources. Democratic resources are important as well. Empowering resources in terms of helping people to begin to think clearly through what they want for their communities and how to access those resources.
Can I just stop you there? What exactly, this word empowerment is very fashionable. Yeah. What do you mean by it?
I would call that double loop learning. I would call empowerment about learning how to learn, how to engage. It's about the learning about the learning process. That's both socially, emotionally, relationally. So
you talked about economic and democratic empowerment. I mean, what that sounds like to me, frankly, when other people use it particularly, is politicization. What you want is people to have a kind of political function, a political consciousness about their role. Is that what you think the solution would be?
I think it is a political issue. It's not a party political issue.
No, of
because
course
I don't think it falls into left or right. But it is political.
Political in the sense what then? That in order for people to be empowered, they have to become some sort of analogue of a political class or a sectarian group? Is that what you have in mind?
No. What I'm saying is that people need to... The political issues are that we have lots of agencies, lots of activity going on within society. But often the people who are on the ground in the communities are often marginalised from those processes, even though we have all the good words.
So the agencies, these agencies that you talk about, are somehow not families in themselves, not organically developed relationships, but they're something that politics can somehow superimpose, that politics can create a level of agencies that which can facilitate what? People taking responsibility. Isn't that a contradiction in terms?
No, I don't think it's a contradiction in terms. I think that agencies play a role and they are important in terms of government action. But what it can't do is deliver good community.
Can I suggest to you, though, that it might be the politicizing of human relationships, men versus women, children versus adults, guarded in a kind of fortress of personal rights, that's made social cohesion impossible?
If you think that women's lib or the fact that we have got anti-racism laws or people...
I didn't say anything about racism.
No, but that's what we're talking about.
No, I was talking about children's rights, for example, as opposed to defend themselves against adult authority.
If we're thinking about rights of people to actually make choices for themselves, to actually make decisions, I think it's important that we don't lose that. I don't think you can throw those things out the bathwater.
David Cook?
Can we move from the very general to the very particular? If it's true that about 85% of crime is committed by young men under 24, how are we going to deal with those young men?
I think one of the crises, I mean, I spend quite a bit of time working with churches and other people who are interested in their communities, looking to do things and make things happen. But one of the issues for a lot of young men is that there aren't many options for them that they can easily find. There are lots of things that they think about that they find difficult to actually overcome. A lot of the barriers that are in there in their
Do they
society.
even feel part of a community?
Sometimes young people do. And there are lots of young people that do feel parts of communities and feel parts of families
So
as well.
why
But
then
there are
such a high rate of crime then?
But there are also young people who don't and are excluded.
So why such a high rate of crime then?
Why such a high rate of crime? It's a number of factors. There is alienation. There is the whole kind of notion of that they don't have a stakehold in the processes within society. They're not necessarily going to be able to get the things that they see in terms of the material benefits of being part of engaged with society through normal means, like getting a good job or whatever. So those sorts of things often they feel that they're denied them.
Peter Hitchens?
As far as I can understand the language you use,
Yeah.
resources, democracy
Yeah.
and empowerment, it seems to me to be a long way of saying more busybodying by outsiders in the area.
No, that's the opposite of what I'm saying.
Well, you think then that there should not be any intervention by outsiders, social workers, state and government in this mess?
I think there does need to be intervention, but I think what needs to happen is that people need to respect the people in the community. They need to respect the community organisations that are on the ground.
Community,
And
what
often
sort of community organisations?
there are churches, there are other organisations that are looking to do things with young people. Often those are the ones that find themselves fighting for resources rather than being able to deliver the work. And so often what you have is resources going into an area, but they go into businesses, they go into big setups in terms of building things or whatever, but they don't actually resource people on the ground, ordinary people in the communities, youth workers, community workers who are looking to do something different.
Shouldn't we just find a way of making individuals learn how to behave as well as they used to?
I don't think that individuals ever behaved well, as it's kind of a myth that we have good behaviour in the past.
Steve Quashie, thanks very much indeed. Our next witness is Patricia Morgan, who's a sociologist and senior research fellow on the family at the Institute of Economic Affairs Health and Welfare Unit. Patricia, you do research in this area. Is your conclusion from that research that the decline of the institution of marriage, and on top of that maybe more mothers staying at home to raise their children, is largely responsible for the state that you presumably would say we're in?
It's one factor,
But
quite
factor?
a big factor. All the research that we have tends to be in one direction, that children, whether it's family fragmentation, whether broken families, you, for example, get twice to treble the level of delinquency. This comes out of study after study. We have very, very big longitudinal studies now. You get twice or treble the amount compared to where there is an intact married family.
You're saying this is statistically incontestable?
Virtually, yes.
And you've ruled out any possibility that there are kind of self-selecting groups that you... yeah, okay, Ian?
We've looked
Hargreaves?
at big population, longitudinal population samples and this, so if you get like
I'm not
10%...
quite sure what that means, but I get it.
Tracing people over time as they move through life.
Right.
If, for example, you have children of married couples intact, in the original married family, with, say, 10% of delinquency, you tend to find that those with lone parents and step-parents have 20%. That comes out quite regularly.
Ian Hargreaves.
What in your view follows from that the state should do what it can to incentivise marriage through the tax system? You believe in that, I think, but then basically keep itself out of human relationships at that level?
And about incentivised marriage, we discriminate against it at the moment.
Well, okay, but I don't want to argue about that particularly. What I'm interested in is your view of whether or not the wider community, as represented by, for example, agencies of government, the kind of work that Steve Quashie did, youth work. Do you think there's a role for that in healthy communities and safe communities?
Quite honestly, I've not come across much which suggests that it makes much of a contribution in this area.
Do you feel the same about social work?
I think social work, if anything, has the opposite impact.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because what therefore are we to do when families go wrong? Because I think you could also point to plenty of longitudinal or latitudinal or horizontal studies that very clearly also demonstrate that problems of drug addiction, anorexia, self-harm, serious personal problems very often, in fact nearly always, have their root in some kind of terrible problem inside the family or the parental relationship.
I know this is going into individual, tackling an individual problem, but I think that you've got to look at the overall social structure first. You've got to look at your incentives and disincentive structure first.
I don't understand what you mean.
You have these broader social movements occurring, and to focus on individuals and trying to fix individuals when you're not doing anything about the broader structure of incentives and disincentives.
But I thought your position was, get people reliably married, keep them married as far as you can, and even you would accept that there's a limit to what you can do.
There is, yeah.
That then that's the end of social policy.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't believe in social work, you don't believe in youth work. I dare say you believe in the police.
I do believe in the police. I would say that you would need the police a lot when you need social work. I would take social work completely out of dealing with, for example, juvenile justice or juvenile delinquency. I would have a simplified juvenile justice system.
What about when you have a situation where, for one reason or another, and we've always had it, children are excluded from school, are expelled from school, they don't go to school, and they get up to all kinds of trouble, hurting themselves and others whilst they're doing it. What is the right way of approaching a problem like that? The mother and father may well be at work during the day, they need to be at work during the day. Who's going to do something about that? Just the police?
No, not just the police.
Who then?
I would suggest that if you have changes in teaching, in education, if you have family changes, if you have changes in the structure of the juvenile justice system, you're not going to get so many kids bunking off school and being a nuisance at school.
But be realistic.
And you go from there. You're going to get obviously a minority.
And what is to be done about those? Whose responsibility are they? Your position is essentially that they are the responsibility of the mother and the father.
No. I could see us going back to what we had before. We had the big reorganisation of social services, creating these big general social service departments in which you had specialists who dealt with particular problems, and you had truancy officers who dealt with that.
David Cook?
I'm just interested, the NSPCC recently said that families were one of the most dangerous places for children to be because most abuse happens in the family context.
Who by?
Well, by various members of the family, particularly siblings and other members. So the parents aren't doing a very good job, are they?
Most abuse in the family is perpetuated by mothers' boyfriends, stepfathers, not by the biological parent. Very uncommon to be the biological and the legal
And
parents
research failed to distinguish between married and unmarried families.
Yes.
But who's to blame? Who's to blame when things go wrong?
If you have a succession of boyfriends coming in and out of a home with a lone parent, that is quite a high risk situation
Yes,
for the child.
we're not actually talking about abuse.
And in fact, there's quite a lot of abuse occurs outside the family proportion. If you look at the time children spend in and out the home, a lot of abuse is occurring outside the home.
Patricia, can I ask you who you would place the blame on for the current state of lawlessness amongst young people?
You can't blame. There's many factors here, and I suppose it's reiterating something I said very much before, that the origins are in the 60s, in the counterculture eruptions we had then, in which all the values of Western society were trashed, and particularly the family was trashed as something that was perpetuating these ghastly things.
But are we saying everybody's to blame or nobody's to blame?
I would think that if you want me to sort of home in on particular things, the rise of permissive child rearing, this pseudo-psychology which emphasised the needs of the child, or rather I would say the wants of the child, and made actually parental authority, and in fact cultural transmission itself, something which was bad for children's minds.
How are you going to change that cultural shift then?
There is proper child rearing advice, but I think we ought to be a bit more concerned for the research, and I'm afraid again in the social services very little concern for research. It does tend to be fashions and the manipulation of jargon. But I would put permissive child rearing. I would put the breakdown in family structure, because certainly if you get large numbers, for example, of fragmented families, you get a tipping point and your problems escalate downwards. Also, I would say changes in policing. If you want to go back to a dangerous situation,
we did ask you. I know,
the
but it's quite a
1840s.
pamphlet
You
you're
had a
producing.
very high crime society then, but crime went down throughout the 19th century.
Even
and policing methods were very important.
Even the
Ian Hargreaves,
police
the last question.
wouldn't argue that they're able to deal with this situation, but you caricature the 60s and blame that. Wouldn't you also, if you're going to be honest about this, have to accept that the economic values of the 80s, economic individualism, affluence, the desire for privacy, that is what stops us, impedes us having a sense of responsibility towards each other, doesn't it? That's why we walk on by.
Well, it seems to be saying that these are economic in the sense these people are poor. And
No,
it's also economic in the sense that they're too materialistic. It seems to be, I tend to be
It's saying that there are values that come out of economics, moral values.
I think human beings always have had a tendency to be hostile, cruel, to perpetuate all sorts of atrocities. They are capable of doing that, whatever, you emphasise economic goodies or not.
Patricia Morgan, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Our next witness is Claire Fox, who's director of the gloriously named Institute of Ideas, which grew which grew out of living Marxism. Claire, are we panicking over nothing, or rather, that's rather insensitive, isn't it? Or rather, over tragic individual events that don't add up to any general crisis?
I think that there is a very serious danger that this is turning a very horrible individual incident into a moral lesson for everybody. Different lessons depending on who wants to do the preaching. And I think that some of the discussion that's even been had tonight and throughout the last few days has completely overstated what's happened and turned young people into demon figures who we should all be scared of and frightened of.
But you can't deny that there are a rising number of tragic events. You're just saying that they don't add up to a pattern that we should be getting terribly worried about.
I don't think there are I don't think there's an evidence of a rising number of tragic events in the way that you're saying. Less than 30 children have killed each other over 250 years, over the last 250 years, and there is a danger that
we're actually talking about yob culture, lawlessness, vandalism, and even you aren't arguing that there isn't more of that than there was.
I'm not convinced that there is more. I think that our perception that there is more of it has changed. I think that we're scared, and I think that when adults behave like scared children, that's not very inspiring to young people.
Peter Hitchens.
Aren't you really being terribly complacent here? If the murder of an 11-year-old boy, a nearly 11-year-old boy, on his way home from a library 3 miles from central London isn't the subject of a moral lesson, then exactly what is?
I hope that the people who were responsible for the killing of this young boy are found, as is everyone else. I do not want to use it politically to make the kind of points that government, the media, and a whole range of social bodies have tried to make. And I think we have to be very careful when we start saying who is responsible for the moral upbringing of children in the way that has been concluded, where everybody says that they all are and that we all have to be involved. Sounds great.
But wait a minute, are you seriously saying that things have not got worse in our country?
I am seriously saying that things have not got worse. There's no more violence,
no more crime, no more coarseness, no more swearing, no more menace in the streets than there was 10 years ago.
I think that our perceptions that things have got worse have really increased. And I think what's happened is that very nasty incidents have always been going on. I started off as a social worker when I left university, and there were terrible things that occurred. And it was understood that this was a minority of people, and there were social services to deal with it. That's what happened. You had that situation. What's now happened is that we've taken the most extreme and writ it large over the whole society. So we take, for example, extreme cases of parents who may be not able or for whatever reasons, to cope with rearing their children, and we turn this into a general panic that all parents are not capable of rearing their children.
An excuse to panic?
And we have a government that then says that all parents are just like those very extreme small number of parents from the past, and that they all need to go on social work courses and parenting lessons and be taught how to look after their children.
Well, they're not saying that. They're saying something has gone seriously wrong. You can't really maintain. Just for instance, in 1931. When unemployment was at 25%, there were 208 robberies in the whole of England and Wales. In 1999, the equivalent figure was 353,000. We do have a problem here. Most of these are committed by young people. Aren't they out of control? Is it really helping anybody to say there's nothing to worry about? 26% of secondary school children say that they're either threatened or bullied in
yes,
school.
But you will know,
there is something
Peter,
wrong.
you will know, won't you, that the definition of bullying, for example, has now been extended from what I consider to be very serious threats to young people, a small group of young people, extreme terror inflicted on them, to now having institutionalised anti-bullying policies that include within their remit name-calling, pulling tongues, and the exclusion of
the definition of robbery
groups.
hasn't changed very much.
Well, I think that the definition of crime has changed quite substantially, and the reporting of crime. And I think we cannot ignore the fact that people are more scared. Adults are more scared. It is also the case that you did not have a situation where head teachers, such as Damiola's head teacher, actually proudly boasted that he had excluded more children from his school than any other in Peckham, and where teachers' unions threatened to go on strike because they're scared of primary school children. This is adults being scared of children. It's not necessarily children behaving more monstrously.
Janet Daley.
Are you saying that we shouldn't worry about anything short of a tragic event or a major felony?
I'm trying to contextualise what's happened since this young boy was killed. I think that what's happened...
all right, then let's leave behind that killing. Let's leave behind that.
I think there's an overstatement of the kind of society we live, the terror of the kind of society we live in, based on conclusions being drawn from that event.
All right, but let's leave behind that event, and let's talk about the escalation of what you might call antisocial behaviour. And by that I mean the terrorising of old people on council estates, for example, the vandalism, hooliganism, which many people would regard, perhaps in the context of this kind of discussion, as being trivial, but which in fact causes people to be terrified within their own environments.
Well, I think that actually I'm more surprised that things haven't got more out of hand, because when you have a situation where young people are being set up as the demons of our age, are being excluded from school left, right and centre, and are being told by adults that they can't cope with them, I'm surprised that young people aren't more out of control.
I agree that adults are being told they can't control them. That's because adults are legally prevented from controlling them. We have legislation now that means that if an adult man, for example, lays a hand on a misbehaving 8-year-old or 10-year-old in the street, he's likely to be convicted of a measure.
Yes, exactly. I agree with you that what we've found is that there's an institutionalised and paralegal and cultural attempt at saying to adults that they should not control young people.
Absolutely.
Yes. So in that context, I'm saying I'm surprised that young people behave at all. In my experience, that's actually by and large teaching in some pretty rough, I apologise to all my students, places over the fact I have found them not to be the demons that the staff room have described them as, and the staff room teachers sit around and say, oh my God, they're all monsters about to kill us, because they've lost confidence in their ability to teach.
And isn't one of the reasons they've lost confidence because they've lost the apparatus for discipline and control, and that has been systematically imposed on
that,
them?
Janet, we agree.
David Cook, a quick question.
I'm just a bit concerned about the statistics here, because in London in 1999 there was a 19% increase in violent crime, and in terms of murder, and I don't think the definition of murder has changed, there was a 30% increase. So surely things are getting worse.
I'm very reluctant, because I think every time I've tried to do a study on crime figures, I've found them contradictory, and there's a whole range of statistics that can be used by both sides in this. In fact, if you look, the statistics that have been most recently come out of Peckham indicates a decline in crime. You would not think that was a fact based on what we've been talking about recently.
So can you just tell me then what we're actually going to do about the violence, however much or little it is then?
What I am concerned about, and I think that this programme is concerned about tonight, is how we can encourage young people to grow up as moral citizens. That's what the question that was set us, as it were, the essay title. And I think that what we need to do is to show young people that we have faith in ourselves as adults and that we can control our own lives and inspire them to want to grow up responsibly. Now, one of the things that most worries me in terms of teaching morality is that parents are being denied the right to teach morality. In fact, they're told that they can't do it. And teachers are being told that they've got to teach personal, social and health education. They've even got to teach citizenship. And I think that teachers should educate, good old-fashioned liberal education. Create a generation of critical thinkers who can actually know what's going on in the world, reflect on it, and the state should leave parents alone to parent.
Claire Fox, thank you for the essay. That's very kind. I did challenge you to agree with Janet Daley beforehand, and you almost made it. You almost made it. Our last witness is Bob Holman, who's a neighbourhood worker and a visiting professor of sociology at the University of Glasgow. Glasgow doesn't just study the state of the poor, but lives with the poor, currently in Glasgow Easter House. Professor Holman, in your work in these poor estates over a long period now, isn't it? And inasmuch as it's possible to generalise, what single factor would you point to that's made the difference between kids turning out okay and turning out badly?
Well, from my experience, I think we've got to look at the decline of neighbourhood. Years ago, many neighbourhoods had large-scale employment, often a single primary industry, which bound people together. Now the same neighbourhoods often have unemployment. In those days, leisure was associated with that industry, and that's gone as well. And at the same time, there's been a decline in the extended family because families are much more mobile. And you put that together, and you have, I think, very deprived communities, few opportunities, and a lack of collective values.
Cohesion and shared values.
Exactly.
Yes. David Cook,
there's one other thing which nobody seems to have mentioned as well, that is the increase of drugs in these areas, which is associated, I think, with crime and with violence.
And boredom.
Indeed.
Yeah, David Cook.
Bob, I want to put a specific case. I talked with a teacher yesterday who told me about a 9-year-old boy who regularly had sexual intercourse with his 7-year-old sister and brought along his friends so they could do the same. Now, who is to blame there, and what can we do about it?
Well, I think one must face the fact that if that's occurring within a family, then the family may not be to blame, but they have to accept responsibility for knowing what is going on. And certainly, if parents do know that, they should contact the much maligned social services department. The other point is that who are these children going to speak to? They often find it very difficult to speak to parents. They may well find it difficult to speak to statutory social workers. And it is important that neighbourhoods have trusted adults, often youth club leaders, the kind of person to whom children can turn to outside of the family if necessary.
But do you think that really works? Do you think that youth work leaders, do you think that teachers actually can make a difference to people?
Well, it does work, and I've done a follow-up study of youngsters I used to work with, 51 youngsters on the Southdown estate. They're now all in their 30s, and although nearly everyone had a troublesome background, the vast majority are now in stable relationships in their mid-30s. And if you ask them why, they say, A, that youth clubs stop boredom. It's old-fashioned to say that now, but playing table tennis and pool actually does help kids. The other thing they say is that there were adults who were available.
Right. I think it's wonderful that there are some adults who are available, but I'm just wondering in our day and age whether people are really prepared either to be youth workers or to be social workers or to be teachers when they can make pots of money in the city.
Well, I think there are, because in the work I do, it's no problem to recruit local people, local residents, to do our kind of work and to be there evenings, weekends. The problem, of course, is to find salaries for them, because we have a government which would sooner put a few millions into building a swimming pool or a great partnership than it would in giving money to local people to run their own projects.
Ian Hargreaves?
Yeah, let's come to this issue of resources, Bob, because the suggestion has been around this evening that resources are nothing to do with this. This is all about, people shaping up and remembering the values that their grandparents had. What in your experience has been going on with the resources applied to these highly stressed communities? You've lived in the middle of it.
Well, I think obviously many resources have gone into regenerating housing, and of course nobody is against that. I'm certainly not, because people have now got gas central heating where they didn't have it before. But it is basically, it's people who need resourcing, because I'm convinced that the most valuable thing in life is relationships, and we've got to facilitate relationships within families and outside of families.
And are you concerned, as a number of other speakers this evening have been, that somehow we are giving outsiders too much power, too many rights to get involved in what's going on inside families? Is that a difficulty?
Well, I think it's true. Clearly, if children are being abused, and I think it's absolutely right that social workers and the police must be involved. But the danger in all this is that we take away the kind of control which local people have over their own circumstances, and it is residents, it's those at the hard end who know what their area want, and I would much sooner any power or resources be given to them rather than people who are going to come in, go out at 5 o'clock, or those who are going to be in huge partnerships, which make good careers for professionals, but really in the end I don't think do a great deal for families.
Peter Hitchens.
Professor Holman, didn't we used to have tens of thousands of unpaid 24-hour duty social workers in all the estates of the country called husbands and fathers, and wouldn't it be rather a good idea to have them back?
Well, I'm certainly with you, and it's Bob. I'm not really a professor. That's a fraud.
I think, forgive me.
I think that the point is that we must facilitate families. It's no good just saying you've got to be a good parent, grow up, pull your socks up. That doesn't work. And one of the things that neighbourhood projects do is that not only that they bring in children, but they also bring in parents, and those parents then begin to support each other in what is good parenting.
Except that there aren't any parents in many cases to speak of. There's one other thing I would like to raise. You talked about unemployment being a factor in this. We've had unemployment in this country before, which makes what happens now look tiny. And yet we did not have the social decay and chaos we have now. Yeah. Can you explain that?
I think there was a difference in the unemployment when my own father was unemployed in the 30s, which was mass unemployment, and there was often a feeling of collectivity even in that. And today I think unemployment is much more individualistic. And I return to a further point I made, is that so often today with unemployed people, unemployed youngsters in particular, they are targeted by drug dealers, and they're drawn into drugs and into crime, and this is a massive problem which isn't being tackled.
Bob, let me interrupt you there, because Janet just wants to ask a question. We're running out of time.
I don't understand how unemployment can be individualistic when you mention whole industries that have shut down in communities that used to be sustained by those industries. But let me just ask you about another category of full-time social workers who are even more full-time than Peter's husbands and fathers, and that was grandparents.
Yeah.
And hasn't the decline of marriage as an institution meant that at least one set of grandparents tends to be eliminated from the life of a great many children?
Yeah, that doesn't always happen, Janet. Sometimes you get two sets of grandparents. I might add that I look after my grandchild two days a week. I'm very much for grandparents, and I think oddly enough you do find in our kind of estate that there are extended families, more so I think than in middle class estates, and grandparents play a very large part in supporting families in deprived areas.
Yes, they're less likely to be further geographically away, I suppose.
Yeah.
Bob Holman, thank you very much indeed. I asked two questions at the beginning of this. Let's take the first one first. Who's to blame? David Cook?
Well, I think it's clear that we're all to blame. I think blame isn't the issue. The issue is how we're actually going to do something. And the suggestions we've had are to do with marriage, they're to do with parenting, They're to do with having adults who are willing to be there and to cope with young people.
We've heard the suggestions. What's your view?
Well, my view is that we ought to help people to understand what is involved in marriage, help people to understand what's involved in parenting, and train up a generation of people who will actually be youth workers and work with young people.
Janet, we don't know what's right or wrong, you started off by saying,
Yeah.
but now you seem to have got down to no grannies.
No grannies is very much connected to not knowing what's right and wrong, because it was grandparents very often who were the strictest teachers of what was right and wrong, and they performed a kind of function, of moral authority function, that is gradually disappearing from most levels of society. I'm very confused about this argument about poverty and affluence, because on the one hand it seems to be unemployment that causes all these problems, and on the other hand it seems to be affluence and economic individualism. I think those arguments completely confused. What seems to me to have happened is that the intellectual fashion for undermining the moral authority of families and adults generally has meant that more and more moral responsibility has been taken on by the state, and the state is a very dangerous arbiter of moral issues.
Let me help you with understanding the argument you can't understand, Janet. The economic affluence causes a problem in that it reduces people's willingness and sensitivity to get involved in the problems that other people have. Doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of people who are very poor
So the people in
indeed.
Peckham were rich people who walked by as Damiola was dying, were they?
No, that's not what's being said. What is being said is that if you have a culture which reflects itself even among relatively poor people of wanting the latest branded trainers, and that being the most important value in a community of young people, then they will be infected by an economic individualism which may look very nice indeed behind your gated house on a big
They're
hill.
infected by
Peter
fear.
Hitchens, you described a collapse of conscience at the beginning of this that, sorry to cut across you here, that Steve Quashie didn't recognise at all. People were never well behaved, you reckon?
Well, I think that's contradicted by experience and by knowledge. People were far better behaved, and there's proof of it all around us. You only need to look at those statistics I mentioned and to ask
But in
people.
a historical context, maybe that was the blip. The 1930s good behaviour was the blip.
Well, it seems a shame, doesn't it, that we actually managed to create a civilized society in which we were both free and ordered, and we are now busily throwing it away. And if you want to know who to blame, I blame the liberal elite who destroyed parental authority, destroyed order in the schools, and trashed the idea that there was such a thing as absolute right and wrong.
Well,
now we see the consequences.
Well, we can argue about history as much as we like, but what we really ought to take from this evening's discussion is the evidence that came to us from two people who worked on the ground a lot, Steve Quashie and Bob Holman, and what they both said was get resources into communities to people who are based in and live in those communities and give them an opportunity to be effective.
All those communities
That's
are
correct.
full of
That's
resources,
correct.
and it's done them no good at all.
But let's not be overly optimistic about communities, because the community in Peckham were terrified and were unable to respond to that situation. So let's not glamorise it. But if we are going to have community, then we're back to the Good Samaritan who didn't pass by on the other side, but actually was willing to get involved, and that's what we all need to do.
Janet, you don't go along with this at all.
Oh, yes, I
Well,
go
that
along
you
with
go along
I go
with. A
along
bit
with
before you
yes,
didn't go
I
along.
don't go along with this argument that somehow affluence has bred among the deprived people of Peckham some sort of casual, over-sophisticated indifference. They didn't respond because they were terrified, and when there are gangs of kids walking around with knives, they have good reason to be terrified, and the law doesn't even protect them. The people who need the resources most are the police, but they also need the support of the intellectual elite of the society for taking control of discipline.
The police will always tell you that they need, above all, the support of the communities in
Yes.
which they work.
Absolutely.
And if those
But that
communities are
means
not
the support of
effective,
the law.
the police can't do
If
their
the Good
job.
Samaritan came to Peckham, he'd probably get knifed.
Oh, Peter, that's absolutely outrageous.
Yeah, we're just
All right, that's it for this week. From our panel this week, Janet Daley, David Cook, Ian Hargreaves and Peter Hitchens, and from me, until the same time next week, goodbye.
The Moral Maze was presented by Michael Buerk and produced by David Coomes. And we'll be joining Michael again on Tuesday morning for another edition of The Choice. This week, he'll be finding out how Christopher Ondaatje came to the decision to turn his back on making money, which he was extremely successful at, to start giving it away instead. Christopher Ondaatje's Choice on Tuesday morning at 9, with the second outing on Tuesday evening at 9:30.